Welcome all, and thank you so much for taking the time to tune in to this really special opportunity to hear from Dr. Lance Linke. First, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Jess Lency. I'm one of the health and wellness counselors at Austin, and I work primarily with the middle school. And I want to let my panelists, colleagues introduce themselves as well. Dr. Driscoll, do you want to go?
Thanks. I want to, on behalf of the administration at Austin Prep, thank the health and wellness counselors for setting up this opportunity with Dr. Linke for tonight. It is a very special occasion, and I know there is need in the population. We've had a number of parents calling us and sending us emails, and the administrators were asking for some support in some really challenging times. And so as we are very supportive of our parents, and we have a good partnership with our parents, we wanted to put on something that would be helpful to you. And I think this is going to be very helpful for all of you out there tonight. And so I'm going to step off stage to allow the experts to do their business.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to let my colleague in the upper school, Mr. Reynolds, introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I think I was on mute there for a second. Just wanted to introduce myself. Nick Reynolds. I'm the upper school health and wellness counselor. And just to echo what Jess and Dr. Driscoll have said, this is, as we saw today with the return, certainly with a lot of students in the school, it feels like this is the perfect time to have Dr. Linke speaking with us, and we feel very fortunate to be hosting him here tonight. So without further ado.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I know I speak for all of us when I say that our partnership with parents, all of you, is really one of the most crucial parts of our roles as educators. The COVID-19 pandemic has presented stressors and hard times that none of us have ever faced before as educators and as parents. And just when we thought parenting couldn't get any more difficult, I know I didn't think it could get any more difficult, it has, now that we have to navigate how to parent amidst a pandemic. So we're so lucky to bring in experts like Dr. Linke for tonight's webinar. Dr. Linke is a clinical psychologist with expertise in self-regulation and behavior change. He holds doctoral level degrees in both clinical and educational psychology. Dr. Linke has worked nationally and internationally with departments and ministries of health and education. Dr. Linke has held faculty positions at a really impressive list here: Hawaii Pacific University, Yale University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, and the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. His research publications are in the fields of cultural, educational, and clinical psychology. Dr. Linke is currently the Director of Child and Adolescent Services at Kendall Psychological Associates, and we're just so grateful to have you here tonight to share your wisdom, advice, and guide us. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear these introductions, and it's wonderful to be part of the Austin Prep community. So I've structured tonight's talk to give a lot of information. I like to give practical skills and strategies. And so a lot of these things are going to be aspects that I think I can give information, but there are also things for us to try as parents naturally, as well as educators. And so I just want to add this caveat that I'm here, and my email will be available too. So if parents have questions, you can certainly reach out, or, part of our discussions, if there's the opportunity to have questions and answers, if I can fully contextualize kind of responses in that time, great. But also feel free to reach out to me, because these are things that we want to be able to try and that need practice in order to really work. But let's discover some of these things together.
And I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just forgot to mention some housekeeping. We do have some questions people have submitted, But if there are questions that come to mind during the presentation, you can feel free to type them into the Q&A, and we will facilitate some Q&A at the end. Take it away.
Great. And everybody can see my screen so far? Excellent. Yep, our directions today, a couple things that we're just going to go over is how to disaggregate not only what's happening in, as Jess mentioned, the challenges of parenting and navigating those situations at home, but also doing so within the context of a global pandemic. We want to look at variables of understanding child and adolescent behavior, as well as improving some of the communication skills. So this is just the overall kind of notion of where we're going this evening. As Jess, you mentioned, and I think it's so important to reiterate that we are in a situation that's truly unprecedented in our lives, and this creates a reflection on what we can do, and just a recognition of the stressors that we're under. One of the things that I find is so important for us is to discern is the difference between knowing what is truly a threat and what is something that is creating anxiety. And so one of the differences that we use to distinguish this when we talk in the field is that fear is a natural reaction to so many things that we're experiencing now. For example, contamination, those are real fears that we need to attend to, that we need to respond to. They're reactions to specific and observable dangers. The differentiation here is important because we're going to start to look at the difference between that and anxiety, which is more an abstract sense of foreboding. It's unfocused. It doesn't really respond all the time to problem solving. And I think it's an important distinction to make so that we can start to discern what is something we can really handle and manage in terms of a fear versus anxiety, which can build in so many ways that is a little bit of a different animal. I'm sure there's questions. I'm going to kind of continue, and then you can type them in as well, because I want to hear how these things may be most applicable to you. And if individuals have questions, certainly feel free to ask. A lot of questions come in around managing anxiety or how it builds during this time and what to do about it in terms of mitigating it. There's a couple things that we've noticed, and you may have already heard these things on the news, but I think they warrant repeating. Specifically, the first one is about news. We're inundated with information these days, and so much of it is important. It's important for a variety of reasons, from health to being politically attuned. And at the same time, we can be overwhelmed with the amount of information because we are in an age where this is so readily accessible. One of the things we found to become increasingly important is titrating the amount of frequency as well as the validity of the information. What I mean by that is we can start to gauge how often we're checking the news. Some of us, many people that I work with find that they are checking it more frequently, and there's that sense of kind of chomping on the bit, if you will, to find out the next thing or find out what is happening in the world. And while some of that is very prudent and important to stay informed, we want to, again, differentiate that from that sense of the impulse or that urge that can start to creep in sometime when anxiety is building. And again, naturally, these are anxiety-provoking times. So it's not necessarily problematic that we're experiencing an increase in activation or anxiety, but we certainly want to note it so that we have more options of how we can manage it and deal with it. The validity of information too is just, we want to check our informational sources. This becomes even more important as parents as we watch the informational sources that our children and adolescents are attending to, just so we know that some conduits of information are more fact-based than others, for example. So are we getting our information from places that are reliable and that are not prompting us to more anxiety, for example. I'll just give this note because I find it very interesting. Is about a decade ago, a lot of large news organizations and internet obviously as well noticed that they could monetize, clicks and interfaces. And the primary way that organizations found that they could engage people and get them to click was through the emotion of anger. Anger prompts us more quickly than any other emotion, even fear, to want to engage, for example, a news story. So again, when we're checking the validity of our news sources, just to make sure that we're not being prompted into situations around, feeling more intense emotion. So again, to titrate that around what is important and to connect about, as well as what may be just more of an emotional reaction that many outlets and internet provide, like websites, are prompting us into emotion to just kind of monetize our attention. Two very big aspects that we found that are beneficial for families in general and individuals specifically are ways to get a sense of control back, focusing on the present. So task orientation, meaning what do I have control over during my day? This can be as simple as homework, getting that completed. It sounds ridiculous sometimes, but even specific tasks or chores, things that give us a sense of completion and control. Emptying the dishwasher is probably not a great example for many of us, but it just gives us a sense, because what we're finding overall is that when we give ourselves tasks and feel like we can complete them, that is giving us more of a sense of control around small things in life, but that actually has an additive effect for us. And so focusing on the present, what we do have control over, what we can complete, and specific tasks become very important for us at a day-to-day level, and is something that as parents we can also integrate into the lives of children and adolescents. Mindfulness is another very big component of this, an awareness of our feelings, of our thoughts, and we're going to get into more of the details of that in just a moment here. So I just want to make a note that this is, we're finding too, more recognition and awareness is providing us with a more calm state in when so much is unknown. Another facet of providing structure is the predictability of routines. This can be done not only in goal setting, but just through daily activities. For children, this is imperative for young children, but it also works very much for adolescents and adults, is having a set routine is it forecasts for the mind what is going to happen that day, and it naturally brings anxiety down. Many of us, even if we like spontaneity, can recognize that having a set routine and goal setting can have a calming effect on us, almost not subliminally, but it just creates a structure and a sense of predictability that the mind tends to like, especially in times where there's a lot less predictability. Even routines, I'm just going to mention this is probably obvious to many of you, but even setting routine times for meals can structure the metabolism throughout the day that we know brings anxiety down. So, eating meals at consistent times, not always an option, because I know we have busy days and things change, but those kind of things, I just want to put a flag in that, because these are things that we're finding have a lot of benefit for, like I said, individuals and families. One of the questions that we often entertain is, how do we start to notice when that, sense of problem solving around fear goes into a higher level of anxiety, and maybe even anxiety that requires additional attention and maybe even additional support? It's an important question, and one of the ways I advocate doing this is obviously checking in and communication. Many of us do this, and so that might seem obvious that we check in with adolescents. one of this couple of things that are less obvious is that we're going to notice behaviors and not just check in with words. Many of us can probably relate to asking our children how their day was, and then you get the response, which is fine. There's a couple different ways for us to kind of assess that. It's in the middle here, asking specific questions. So less general questions tend to offer more opportunities of engagement. So how was math class? What did you learn? Even in a question like that, that's just geared towards something very specific, there can be discernments of frustration or enjoyment that might give us little cues to be able to entertain a more rich dialogue versus a global, how was your day? Or how are things going? Or did you have a good day at school? Yes, and then it's kind of over. There's different ways to assess that, and specificity and specific questions give us some of those inroads. The triad that I always check with clients around eat, sleep, exercise, these are imperative. They're often the bellwethers that will start to, exercise or appetite or sleep sometimes fluctuate when anxiety rises. Those are natural states in some ways, but when they become more extended, they're places we can check in and start to notice that. Mood is probably obvious to everybody, and again, discerning more challenging moods from like the normal vicissitudes of adolescence. We can discuss that if you have questions, but these would be things like, is this chronic? Are we seeing this day after day? Physiological complaints, so somatization, stomach aches, headaches, can't go to school today, kind of things are also, we want to recognize the possibility that in the back of that or underlying that, there might be other factors such as emotions or thoughts that are driving somatic complaints. A lot of times this is for younger children as well, but social anxiety and reassurance seeking. We might see this in different ways. I would even add to this list for adolescents, like compulsions, like news checking and things like that would be places like, oh, are we starting to see repetitive behaviors or something that's looking more compulsive in terms of that? And I'm not using that word clinically, but just a kind of a heightened urge. And these are places, again, that specific questions are allowing us access to maybe talk about some of these thoughts and feelings that wouldn't be as readily accessible if we had just said, how was your day or how was school? Again, I've touched on structured activities and routines, the predictability. The other aspect of this, easier said than done, is modeling calm behaviors. So modeling reactions to situations. We know this from younger children and also adolescents. They're consistently watching our reactions. And so, again, easier to say than to do sometimes, but to kind of recognize without the notion of putting too much pressure on us, that we're on the stage, that we're going to be watched by our children to see how we respond to the stressors of the big ones as well as the minor ones, to see how they're going to gauge their reaction, oftentimes by gauging ours. When we get into the larger, more intense emotions, this is a kind of, we're going to talk about what we can do in the moment, but this is more of a bridge across how we're going to handle large, intense emotions in adolescence that we sometimes see overall. That means this is not in the moment, kind of. We can talk about specifically how to de-escalate situations, but we are talking like a more overarching long-term game plan is to provide choices to our children. We want also to understand their goals. It's so important, and one of the refrains of today's discussion is going to be that we're going to get really curious about what their rationale is. We want to hear from them. Even, I understand, sometimes we can think that's aberrant or kind of ridiculous. We can even think they're not speaking logically, but it's so important for us to hear their rationale to things, even if we don't agree with it, because it will give us the inroads to actually have a conversation, validate which makes somebody listen more, and ability to negotiate with them. So even if we don't agree with our children, with our children's rationale for things, we certainly, we want to understand where they're coming from and why. This kind of discussion, the choicefulness, the reflection on goals and negotiation all starts to increase the prefrontal cortex functioning. And that just means that it's a part of the brain that deals with executive function. And so when we are able to use these planning centers, these executive functioning centers, when we're putting things into words and talking together, it increases our ability of thinking and planning and logic, and it decreases more emotional reactive parts, and it decreases or manages the limbic system more. So it's one of the rationales for why we talk about things in the long term. We want emotional expression to be verbal because it allows it to be processed more. One of the aspects of this that I had on here was providing choices. This becomes really important. We use this with young children all the time because we want to build up a sense of autonomy and choicefulness. But we know adolescents are in a developmental period where they're also asserting their autonomy. And so, of course, we're going to set limits. But within that, we can a lot of times give choices. Even something like, if you'd like to go to that party or meet up with your friends or play video games, you can complete your homework and then do that. Or if you don't complete it, you don't get to do those things. Even within those limit settings, it provides a choice, and setting up things as a choice does two things. One, it gives a sense of autonomy and decision making back to the child, as well as starts them thinking about, oh, do I want this or this option? And it seems like even if we didn't give huge options, it still sets that part of the brain in motion. And again, that's more the prefrontal cortex, that planning and executive functioning part, that we are advocating building up, and so that it can handle and manage strong and difficult emotions as well. If we can, I put decide together with a question mark on it, because when it's possible, we want to be able to structure decisions together. So again, negotiating. A lot of times we will even provide choices and consequences when we're all calm. We can do this in family meetings. We can do it in, whenever, good times during the day when we're together. And it has the advantage of kind of getting tacit, if not explicit, kind of consent around an agreement around what the consequences are going to be. This is important for at least two reasons. One is, again, the predictability. We know what's coming down the street. If we don't do this, it's this. And so there's less surprises for the adolescent, and they've kind of tacitly agreed to it. So you can kind of step out of the role of punisher and more as like just arbitrator. And, these are the things we agreed to. I'd love for you to be able to use the car, but it wasn't, this is what happened, and we agreed upon it a week ago, and that didn't happen. The assignment wasn't completed. So fortunately, I would love for you to have it, but you cannot. Again, easier said than done, and we can kind of walk through the steps of that, but I'm just outlining these basic principles. The other part of deciding together is that it allows them to have input into kind of what the consequences are going to be as well. And that is it's a very important notion, because I think it gets the buy-in to be much higher, and also in the engagement process. So, and one of the things is when we're providing choices, it's just important to notice that, or to note that we are going to have to choose. We're going to have to be, whatever they choose, we're going to have to be accepting of the outcome. So if you give two choices about whether they can or cannot attend a family function, for example, be ready if it's not the choice that you wanted. And so we don't want to provide choices, obviously, for things that we can't accept. But a lot of times we find that parents will offer choices and hope that the child will, or the adolescent will pick up on that. And we just want to be sure that, yep, we are A-okay with either direction it going. So, emotion regulation with younger children, and by younger, I'm saying under 10, we base it on these basic emotions, which I've listed here. The more sophisticated we get, I have this emotion wheel here as an example. But I'm also going to note that even for adults, when we get really into higher levels of activation and high emotionality, it's sometimes very effective to go back to our basic emotions just to know what we're feeling. Labeling these things, again, is the prefrontal cortex. So we're getting out of that emotional reaction. So even when we're getting into territory that's of higher emotionality, checking in with each other, what are we feeling? You can even model this. I'm feeling kind of disappointed and distraught, as ways to kind of signal and build this. These are the languages that we find effective for communication strategies, because once you're naming, it takes you out of it in the moment, because the limbic system is just high activation. But to think of the names to these things takes us out of the emotion momentarily to try to name or label it, and that actually helps a processing mechanism of being able to manage the emotion and regulate it better. And so I've included these here as just kind of ways that we can use the emotion wheel or the basic emotions to do that. We complement this with what we call emotion thermometer. We call it a SUD score. It doesn't matter. A SUD score is subjective units of distress scale. The names don't matter. Scale from 0 to 100. 0 is feeling A-okay. 100 is the worst you've ever felt. This is another way to create a barometer or a thermometer, if you will, of your activation levels. And I say yours as parents because it's so important that we are also practicing these skills. We want to know how activated we're getting. And it's very important and actually very helpful for us to start to notice how activated we are in response to, let's say, family dynamics or family interactions, or if we're starting to get agitated, it becomes very helpful to notice whether I'm at a 30 or a 50, because those are actually, I'm going to start to watch my behavior change. And much in the same way as we label emotions, labeling our intensity of emotions is another tool and mechanism we have to not only regulate ourselves, but recognize and become aware of how we're feeling. And as we model these skills, we can also ask, sounds like that math homework was super frustrating. You had a very agitated response to, your peers this afternoon or your friends. And is that like, are you saying you're at a 60? And start to calibrate this together. It also gives us a vehicle to share with each other what our experience is, and to kind of notice and be able to check in with each other about it. I've included this, I'm going to skip over this pretty quickly, but because this is for younger children, but it's interesting to note that Rudolf Dreikurs said children have goals. And one of the reasons I just wanted to include this is to show us that there's a developmental arc to some of these things. And it's just interesting sometimes to note as we look back in years, Dreikurs' notion was that misbehavior was either attention seeking or a struggle for power, or there was revenge, like a child had been hurt by the parents and felt like they had to strike back, or displays of inadequacy, which is kind of like learned helplessness. And those were the 4 categories that he came up with. And I just thought it's interesting as we're discussing emotions and managing thoughts and feelings, just to kind of look back and think, even in yesteryear, what some of the impetuses were for misbehavior in the past. And sometimes linking those things becomes interesting and important. It's not for everybody, but I just wanted to include that to kind of think about it. Misbehavior now can look quite different. One of the ways that I have parsed this apart, and what, you know, some of the skills and kind of conceptualizations that I use clinically are to break this into ABCs. Affect is emotion, obviously. There's developmental parts of emotionality at this age, especially during adolescence, where the emotional systems, the limbic systems, are more activated, and the prefrontal cortex, this planning, executive functioning part that I've been discussing, is still coming online and still formulating. So you get a high amount of emotionality without a lot of planning, which sounds like an apt description of some of the kind of thoughts we might hear at times. There's also biological sensitivities in emotionality, and I'm going to touch on that in just a second and unpack that. Behaviors, we see a lot of impulsivity, for example. These are things that, again, because the prefrontal cortex is not fully formulated at this juncture, and they're still learning how to plan and impose logic and manage emotions and thoughts, there can be a higher amount of risky behaviors. And so, again, we're going to go back to some of those skills we just mentioned, and introducing and activating the planning parts and modeling that. And that goes hand in hand with understanding cognition. That's goal creation. And I'm going to talk about mindset, the importance of it in a second here as well. I felt like I wanted to include some of this research because there's a burgeoning research in this field. And some of you may be acquainted with this, but I think it's important to just, it's not the only kind of categorization that we have, but there's an emerging empirical evidence that there's about 3 different types of what I call like a biological sensitivity. The authors of this, Leonetti and a number of different authors who've been working on this, have called it orchids, tulips, and dandelions. And this kind of means like orchids are a more fragile flower that, when are in enriched environments, very much bloom. And so they do excellent if they are given a lot of the skills. They're sensitive to their environmental stimuli. These are children and adolescents that you might find like can be, we might describe them as like more on the anxious, like it's a child that if you yelled at them, they would kind of freeze or have that startle response. They might even have like physiological sensitivities, like not enjoying or enjoying certain feels of even material or clothing. It can run the spectrum, but it's something that I just, there's a lot of nuances to what sensitivity means, but I'm using that as an overarching term to just maybe get the point across that when these sensitive individuals are in environments that are very enriched, they do excellent. However, when they are in environments that are a little bit more challenging or even toxic, they will very much do worse because they're reacting to the environment in a very sensitive way. I'm going to juxtapose that with dandelions, who, if they're in an enriched environment, yep, they might do a little bit better, and it's just they are going to do, but it won't be, they won't need the enriched environment. Won't help them so much more than how well they're already doing. And in distinction, they will also not be as affected by more challenging environments. So like a dandelion, their resilience is higher. And so they will also feel like if they're in a challenging or stressful environment, they'll still do okay. They might do a little bit worse, but it won't be like the withering that you see of an orchid. So this metaphor, and then tulips fall perhaps obviously in between those two. But I think it's an interesting categorization that I like to share with parents, because 2 things become interesting. One is to, I imagine many parents also, like their flags are going up and kind of assessing it. It becomes usually pretty easy to bin our children. And then in addition to that, I think it's interesting to kind of assess ourselves and any of the caregivers or parents in the situation, because it's interesting of what we find when we have 2 dandelion parents, for example, who are pretty resilient, and they get an orchid child and they're like, what's happening? Like, just get over this. This shouldn't be a big deal. And there can be many permutations of this. but I think it's important to kind of acknowledge and kind of reflect upon how this emerging evidence around biological sensitivity can play into even our day-to-day structured activities and how we discuss and understand each other's emotions. I won't spend too much time on this one but the study is very interesting. And this is the notion of mindset. I had that with goals up there. And one of the things that we are finding is that this study was done about believing that you had a genetic risk for being able to exercise more or not more, or whether or not you had a genetic risk of obesity or not. And what we found in the short term, I'm going to do big brushstrokes, and if anybody's curious, we can get into more detail about it. But what they found is just believing that you had a genetic factor for some of these things like exercise or obesity actually changed your physiology. People would be able to breathe less, their running endurance changed, and even if they had a biological or genetic risk factor for some of these things, they would act as if they didn't, if they were just told they didn't. So the notion of that mindset, and this is another body of emerging literature, is that it's so important what we believe about how our mind and body and emotions work, is that it actually changes physiology. This has been known for us for decades as the placebo effect, and we're starting to actually understand this and unpack it a little bit. But why I'm mentioning it now is that many of the young people, as well as adults that we talk to now, will, for example, say, I don't believe things can change, or I don't think things are going to get better. And it's interesting to note that even those thoughts can have compounding effects on what we think is possible. So, for example, if I didn't think things could get better or that I could control my thoughts at all, I would obviously maybe even be less motivated to try new things or to change the way I will approach or how much time I will invest in trying to change anxiety, for example, or sadness, or making the world a better place, or, environmental stressors, for example. So I think it's just, I just wanted to put that in there, and as an important piece of information that we're learning more about, and to signal the importance of mindset. One other aspect that I think is, that I imagine almost everybody knows about, is behaviorism, but I think it gets underutilized, to be perfectly honest. And it's not the whole story, but it's a big part. And what I mean by that is, many people understand that there's reinforcement schedules, meaning, can give rewards or withhold rewards. But what we're finding, and what I work with so many people on, is using this in a day-to-day way. So for example, we're going to start to utilize rewards in a very predictable way, so we know what they are and when they're coming. We might, so for example, with homework, homework becomes a large problem for many families, and integrating kind of the choice that I mentioned before, it could look something like, you get to choose whether you want to come home or finish school and then you are going to do homework right away or take a break. And so we introduce a sense of choice. And then after that, either way, when the homework gets completed, then we may get some reward that might even be as simple as relaxation time, or you choose what it is, or video game time once homework's completed. It seems obvious. I imagine many of you already do this, but doing it in a conscientious way, in a planful way, and hanging rewards on task completion is just a great way to behaviorally entrain our minds, because many of us know, for example, oh, I should do this, like we'll watch the movie first and then I'll read that chapter, or I'll finish my work later. And it's like we're sitting through the movie and we have that in the background, we have that thing that I didn't do yet. And so it's like we don't fully get to relax and the task isn't done. And so if we can move that, this is easier said than done for some things, but it's like if we can do start to find smaller tasks, carve them out, and then give ourselves a reward, we're also teaching our body and mind, yep, we can get through things. And after that becomes a time for relaxation. And I actually enjoy them more because I've completed those things. So I think it's important to note. The other aspect of this is reinforcing improvement. And again, it seems intuitively obvious when we say it out loud, but I think it's one of those things that's still underutilized. So for example, if we have a D in a class and we are moving up into, wanting to get A's and B's, a lot of times we feel like, C- is something that we don't want to reward, but actually we do want to reward these incremental increases because we can break tasks down into smaller components and reinforce those. So even if the entire bathroom wasn't cleaned, but as we wanted, but the mirror was wiped down and some stuff is still on the counter, we can still reinforce and say, great job wiping down the mirror, for example, and this still needs to get done. So it doesn't have to be on or off all the time in terms of the goals we want to reach, but that we want to acknowledge what is working. We're going to keep what's working, and we're going to continue to strategize about what still needs to be worked on. I included this as just a kind of a little placeholder. I'm going to describe it quickly, and then we can move on because I think it's an important notion for the mindfulness component. These are things like that are just inserted to decrease our amount of stress. And one of the mindfulness exercises that we do is especially when we're feeling activated, is we notice and describe 4 visual stimuli. So I would notice 4 things around the room. I would describe them. You can do this out loud. You can do it in your head, obviously. Then I would do 3 tactile things. So 3 things that I touch. How does this feel? The hardness of the desk, for example. My shirt feels a little bit soft, or my tie feels, a little bit different, and the wall feels smooth. Then 2 auditory stimuli, things I'm hearing in the surrounds, and then 1 stimuli or 1 observable smell in the room. Smell tends to be a little bit more challenging, but it's like, when we get near things, we can, the computer kind of, the fan, there might be like a metallic smell, or the laundry detergent in our clothes. What this does is puts us in the moment, and it's a way to decrease our emotions and decrease and de-escalate heightened emotions in the moment. So I just wanted to put that in. This is something you can try and see if it works for you. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide either, but I wanted to include it because it's an interesting way that things can be heard. Of course, in the interest of time, as parents, we also want to be quick and ameliorate the stress and suffering of our children. For example, bullying can be like, you can see clear as day that these other kids that are saying ridiculous things are just being toxic and nonsensical. And so just ignore them might be a way that you think it's a logical solution, and you want that for them as quickly as possible. And this isn't always the case, but I'm just submitting this as for us to kind of consider. What can be heard sometimes is like, not an understanding, because if that really hurt their feelings, they might in their head be saying back, well, I can't just ignore them. I'm walking in there every day. It's terrible, and I'm feeling stressed about it. That can also go for things like, don't worry, you can see, with all of the experiences and expertise in your adult life, kind of the larger arcs of these things. But one of the things we're just noticing is we want to understand their perspectives and not seem to minimize it. And I'm not saying this is happening intentionally. It's just, I'm submitting this just for a little bit of reflection, because a lot of times it can be unintentionally invalidating, because the response is like, do they really not understand how frustrating this is, or how sad it is for me to walk in this every day, or how debilitating it feels? And so I just wanted to notice that even with the best intentions, sometimes we want to rush to make situations better and can inadvertently kind of gloss over the intense emotions and some of the complex thoughts that are underlying these situations for our adolescents. When we do get into escalated situations, we know that rationality is impaired. This is not time for lecturing. It's funny because it's, many of you probably know this intuitively already, but it's, sometimes we find that parents, when they become more escalated, they want to just lay down the law a little bit more or make it clearer. Like, how is this not clear? And so they want to explain and lecture more. And it's actually important to note that once the limbic system and the emotions rise, we are listening less. We know that there's specific ways to discern high emotion perspectives. Words like always, never, everyone, no one. These kind of absolutist words are indicators that we're in emotion mind. So all or nothing statements or large general statements, we can even catch ourselves doing this. And it's really important just so that we can kind of go back and identify, from the emotion wheel, what we're feeling, and from the thermometer, how intense it is, and start to discern what we're feeling when we're starting to say, you never listen to me, whether that's coming from our children or from us. And we know that these things escalate. So that just ping pongs back and forth. When we start to get activated or they start to get activated, we get into this kind of emotional arms race. And obviously there are huge advantages to emotions because they do allow us to communicate. One of the prime ways to insert a sense of listening to a situation that's become escalated is to validate. And I'm just going to say off the top of this is so important, is that validation does not mean agreement. So we can validate each other's emotions. I hear you're feeling super frustrated that I had to set boundaries with you, or that you couldn't go to the game today. It doesn't mean we agree with their perspective. They could even have other behaviors that were totally inappropriate, yelling at you or more extreme things. But it does signal that we understand some of the aspects of what was driving that. And what happens, even unconsciously, is that it engages the person because they already feel heard. They're like, oh, you're actually saying like how I'm feeling. And that automatically creates a link to the person that they're more likely to pay attention. If we say, you don't ever, we can know from our own experiences, probably experiences with others, that immediately shuts down listening. I mean, some people don't get past, if you start a sentence with you, some people will stop listening there. And so validating is a prime way to start a back and forth. And if even not that, just to get the other person to listen. We also know, I wanted to introduce these studies because they're seminal studies, that just validating people reduces heart rate and changes skin conductance, and it changes emotion. So we know this stuff works. Also, perhaps at times easier said than done. But one of the ways that we complement this sense of validation is with communicating emotions and using I language. So we are going to consistently say what I'm feeling is, and less you are doing this. Just noticing time, I want to be respectful of having time for questions and answers. But when I have a couple of slides here of how to construct I statements, instead of, gosh, you're always late, or you never tell me where you are. We can kind of reconstruct this into, I statements around, when you don't tell me where you're going, I feel scared and then share the rationale, because I love you and I want you to feel safe. This gives a longer construction as well as sharing your feelings. And then they can say, well, I sometimes tell you where I'm going. We don't want that back and forth. We just want, there's no when you're making I statements, there's no ground to disagree because you're just saying how you're feeling, and it improves communication. I've included some examples so that you can just kind of look over this in your own time. I won't go through them now, but I just wanted you to be able to have them. I've also expounded upon this about how we deconstruct challenging situations about, again, defining the issue is what we just discussed. You can do that doing I statements, and in conjunction with validation, we can start to look to problem solving, finding alternatives, and again, using that same kind of decision making and discussion together to say, oh, what do we need to change? If you're not home on time, we have to have these consequences. What do you think the consequences should be? And then maybe we'll try a week of that together. Communication strategies around this. It's okay to have plans. It's actually important that we have structured time and that you think ahead. A lot of times having intense emotional exchanges, especially in spontaneously, is just too much. So you can have mantras. I even say writing things down and taking notes so that you can go back to it and be like, listen, it's that I love you, that I want you safe, that I worry. That's why I'm setting these. This is why I'm asking you to be home versus I just told you so. Not that anybody on this would do that kind of abrupt I told you so's, but we can find the contextualization. Again, staying silent for a bit longer allows that sense of curiosity and it allows us to understand their rationale. And for sometimes when things get really escalated, it's just important to pause the situation. There will be times when we say, I love you, I want to discuss this, we are going to discuss it more, but either I am or you seem to be too escalated, and it's getting to a place where we're not being able to communicate effectively. These are all the component parts that I've put into this slide about constructive discipline, about planning ahead and providing opportunities for it to be different in the future. So, yep, next week or this week we can implement this, and if it's good after this week, we can also negotiate about how that might look different. This emotional intelligence piece, I think I've covered a lot of it. In the interest of time and answering your questions, I will just go continue. And making these strategies sustainable. What I've discussed here is a lot of empirical evidence, literature, skills, and strategy. These should be able to be integrated almost seamlessly with not only your relationships with children, but adult relationships. They should integrate with school as well as individual therapy. It's about creating experiments, trying these things on, finding one thing at a time. Like, for example, just doing I statements and concentrating on that for a couple days or even a week. And the hallmark of many of these things is just to continue practicing and practicing them together. I've included references, and thank you so much for your time. I also obviously want to be able to entertain questions as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Linke. I immediately want to use some of these strategies and skills with my own kids and homework tonight and my students tomorrow. I love the way you kind of bring emotions to the prefrontal cortex in terms of naming them and calming things down. I love thinking about it that way. So thank you. We have a couple questions, if you don't mind. I think, parents are wondering, in our experience last spring and in the fall, it can be really challenging to do remote learning with kids and to figure out how to best increase focus, maintain focus, and kind of get kids motivated out of bed. And I wonder if I know that we're all searching for and it's not an easy answer, but like any kind of quick tips about increasing focus and motivation.
Yeah, that's true. We've known that, especially with how one of the ways we work with ADHD, for example, focus can be trained. And so we want to start to explore very much more difficult in this time of so much screen time. but one of the things we do is set even egg timers, things like that. And if there's concentration problems or focus issues, what we do is be able to concentrate for even 5 minutes, 10 minutes, concentrate on a worksheet, and then discontinue. So then you get up and relax. And what we're doing is that time on task becomes something that creates a sense of efficacy and a notion of being able to stay on task, even for that short window. And then we'll start to expand that window over time. So things like executive function, focus, and attention can actually be trained in that way. Right now, eye exhaustion, the ability to just be off task, as much as we can for those children that have that aversion to it, as much as we can bring it out of the screen into, you can even see if, printing things out or doing some of the work off of a screen, if it's helpful, if that's part of the contributing issue, that should be, that should help. And so those are 2 ways that we found.
Thank you, Dr. Linke. I have another question here that this one is focusing on how do we help our child deal with the sense of no control when the school could possibly switch back to remote learning quickly, and how going forward, just providing that control.
Yep, absolutely. It's a great question. And there's so many things that as adults, we just don't know, even about the state shutting down, or the country, or globally for that matter. So there's a lot of unpredictable factors. What we want to do is what I mentioned at the top of our discussion today, was trying to focus on what we do have control over, and to really bring up the sense of what is predictable, and kind of task completion, and creating that sense of predictability, routine, as well as things that we feel like we can manage. And so while there are a lot of things, and it's important to discuss with trusted and loved one, trusted loved ones, like to get those emotions out and discuss about the anxiety we could be feeling about having to go back, we also want to acknowledge and foster those parts that we do have control over, because just in the aggregate, having more experiences daily about things that we can control. And sometimes it's like we're doing a lot of things we can control, but we're not acknowledging that we do have control over them. And so even telling our mind, yep, even just I get to choose when I'm going to do this, or having choice and having that sense of predictability, we want to flag that for the mind as like, yeah, in a sea of different things we can't choose, you do have a rudder and a keel that are allowing you to make some choices. And that gives us, again, for many of us, a sense of at least a little bit of a win back, and more of a sense of efficacy in this world, especially when there's unpredictability.
I have a question here from the audience. My child resists having structured conversations with his father and me. What's your recommendation on how to initiate a discussion about behavior?
It's great. Part of what I would start to look for is like structured. Does that mean like sit down face to face? It's time, like I'm going to take some notes here about what you're doing, and I'm going to tell you. I'm not saying it goes that way, but for many times there will be an automatic resistance to that. A couple of things I might experiment with. What about taking a walk in the evening? What about, bringing it into another environment, or that there's not much of a sit down, or, are there times I would start to investigate whether there's the possibility of having those discussions at a calm time, or maybe after we've just watched a movie, or, is there more back and forth at certain times of the day when we're feeling good or more relaxed, or on the weekends? A sit down, structured, I've said predictable and like planned discussions are important, and I think they are. But for some children and adolescents might bristle at that a little bit, and so we can explore the possibility of taking those into different situations. Or we're going to try something new. Nighttime, when we're feeling physiologically tired, when our defenses are down, that might be a time too, when it's more relaxation. It can also be a time of higher emotionality. So there's some caveats to this, but those are some of the places that I would start to look and see if the aversion is to the structured, like, is there also a notion of like, we're going to tell you what you've done wrong? Just to, I'm not saying that's the case, but just to check, because children will also be like, I am not walking into a situation where I'm going to get a half an hour lecture of being told how I was wrong, especially if there's a sense of, autonomy against that. So I would just start to look at some of those possibilities as ways to introduce that. And I would say too, you can start with smaller things, the emotion thermometer, how you feeling, specific questions, are there times where they are more forthcoming? Even the car ride home. Yeah. How's your relationship with a specific friend versus, how are things going? And just to see if that accesses different ways of back and forth or discussion.
Nick, do you have another question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you had, but this one's regarding teen mental health. And how might a parent know the difference between the quote unquote normal acting out in teen behavior and concerning behavior during this time? Would you say?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of those important ones. We're going to look for a couple of things. Changes, the adolescence and development, this developmental phase brings a lot of changes, but we're going to look for things that are more chronic, certainly risky behaviors, anything that's dangerous gets flagged immediately. That's perhaps pretty obvious, but again, too, as that slide that I had at the top around noticing eat, sleep, exercise, changes in behaviors, what is looking like, are there kind of, instead of, let's take anxiety, for example, instead of, gosh, there's this problem with people not wearing masks and, this is the kind of solution we could, like, people should just do that. That's a pretty good, like, fear response, because it's pretty much an acute fear that has problem-solving possibility to it. Not all things have problem-solving possibility, but it would be different from like, God, we're all going, like everybody's going to catch this, or something's going to happen to our family. Like, that's more nebulous and abstract. And so we would start to disaggregate those as like, is there this sense of impending foreboding doom, for example, or, like this abstract bad things could happen that I feel like I don't have control over. That would be like an anxiety world. Depression world would be like, of course, missing these years. These are natural reactions to like frustration and sadness. Does it get into this won't get better, or the internalization, like something's wrong with me, or there is like, I won't come out of this, like missing my senior year sports will have repercussions for the rest of my life. Those are places that might be extreme, but it's like, somebody will say, if I don't get this, then this won't happen, and this won't happen, and this won't happen. And that would be a place where we would start to say, okay, I totally understand that that's stressful. And it seems like we're onto an amount of worry or forecasting in the future that we want to investigate a little bit more.
Thank you.
And if anybody has follow-ups to these, or that I didn't fully answer it, please let me know, as I'm happy to expound upon it.
I wonder if you could talk about academic fears and worries. I know our kids are put a lot of pressure on themselves. Our parents are rightly so concerned about academics right now. And I wonder if you have thoughts about easing worries about what we've missed, what we're getting, where we're going.
Yes, and a lot of these things, the world is changing rapidly in many ways, and so it's like we don't even know what post-secondary education is going to look like in a couple of years too. But there's, obviously these things are important, and so again, there's very fundamental things about this process that are, grades are important, and post-secondary schools are important. And at the same time, one of the things we can do is just examine the the kind of feelings thermometer or that SUD score to say, like, if we're at 8s continuously about that, you know, as a parent or as a child, we want to start to investigate that, like that chronic stress may be incommensurate. Although these things are very important, we may be even debilitating ourselves around this worry. And so, you know, we want to explore that and like go into the big picture, like, why is it so, seems obvious, but grades are important for this. And then this means that, you know, this means that getting into a good university, and this means that I will get a good job, and say, you know, then we start to recognize that when we are in outside of our emotions or come down, is the worry as high when we're in like what we call wise mind or best mind versus when we're like emotionally activated? And start to notice, do those kind of forecasts or those worries change when we're out of that emotion? And so those would be some of the places that we would kind of investigate that, because of course grades are important, and getting into a good university, extremely important. And are they causing an amount of stress and activation that maybe it's hitting on other fears, like, oh my gosh, we won't be successful, or these things won't work? And are they looping into larger kind of fear, or I should say anxiety in terms of the words we've been using today? And, you know, do those tend to de-escalate when I'm feeling more calm? That'll give us an indicator of like how we might bring that calmness into a planning mode versus a sheer anxiety, or feelings like things won't work out, or like what's the strong necessity of these things working out versus, okay, of course this is important, and we'll plan a series of strategic steps to make it so. Does that seem to get at some of those aspects?
Yes, thank you. We had one more related to screen time. Of course, we all know about Zoom fatigue and just the we are a one-to-one iPad school. The kids have a great access to technology, but it can be a lot, and it can add to the distraction. Just wondering about limiting, a parent asked about limiting screen time or monitoring that.
Yep, this is going to go hand in hand with, it's a caveat for this entire discussion, I think, is also these things go seamlessly together with parental values and family values. And we all have different kind of notions about what we find acceptable and what we find healthy. Generally, I think limitations of screen time are fine. We're on these things a lot these days. We know that there's benefits for, you know, spending time outside, or not having this amount of visual distance that we're always looking at a screen, and, you know, looking at things further away, and just that's healthy for a number of reasons. If it's being complemented, the big ticket items I would look for right away, is this complemented with a sense of like fresh air, being away from screens? Is there a continuous, like, almost urge or compulsion to be near screens? Like, we can start to notice this, like, I mean, for many of us, being away from this for 2 hours should be a pretty manageable feat. And if it's not, then we can kind of entertain, or at least an hour, then we can kind of entertain other possibilities. So I think even carving out for families time away from the screen becomes super important, even if that's an hour in the day, or certainly during things like, all schedulers are different, but I'll give the example of doing dinner together and having a no screen time time with family, even if that can be carved out for smaller increments of time. I think those are things that we have found generally are very healthy, because it's not that we're going to exclude them entirely, but that we're also noticing that without them, we don't feel a sense of missing. I'll say one thing more about that, just to go into the behaviorism that I discussed before. There may be times like video games, I feel like, oh, I should, you know, not use those because we're on the screen too much. Like, again, we want to be healthful and, you know, consider ocular health, things like that. But we can also use those as reward systems. For example, in order to earn screen time or video game time, there might be time out, you know, either chores or time off screen that we can use as an incentive, and a behavioral reward then can be to re-engage those things.
Dr. Linke, could you help the parents this isn't a question coming from them. This is a question I've heard as an administrator. We have a community covenant where people have agreed to do certain things to protect the community, primarily not congregate in large gatherings, large social gatherings. How would you advise parents who are having responsible conversations with their kids and their kid is asking back, but there's 28 kids over there, I want to be with them, why can't I be there?
Yeah. Again, these are challenging situations. We're going to run into a lot of permutations of this. This also runs into a variety of kind of implementation strategies that vary by school district, by family. Like we all tend to even comport ourselves differently around these social distancing guidelines. And so one of the ways I would do it is to have these conversations early and often. So again, in the same way that we discussed, is kind of if you're going to set parameters and guidelines and consequences, for behaviors around being with others or even breaking those rules, let's be very clear and even decide together what some of the limitations may be. Again, getting the rationale, I would very much listen to, I want to be with them. Yeah. And so do you feel like you're going to miss out? And there's many places in that we can obviously validate. Of course, we want you to be there, versus just a hard no, or you don't understand, or the medical guidelines say this. It's like, we want to get into the side of the empathy and the validation around, my God, I too want to be with my friends or with our family more. And yes, it is so frustrating. So that, again, we start to build up that sense of connection, and then are able more to negotiate around those boundaries, as well as also understand what choices we have, the parameters, and maybe deciding together what the consequences are going to be. But these are tough situations that don't have the easiest answers, because for some of us, the most helpful response is obviously not congregating, and other people may be doing it. So one, understanding the rationale for not doing it, understanding the rationale for wanting to do it, would be points of departure for kind of creating a dialogue together, how we can support each other in challenging situations when maybe not everybody's following the rules that we think are the most important to follow.
Great. Well, I don't have any more questions. I'm not Dr. Driscoll or Mr. Reynolds.
Nope.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Linke.
Absolutely. Thanks for
Thank you.
all of, thank you for the community too, to stay after and ask these important questions and dialogue together. So I'm very appreciative that have this opportunity to talk together. And it's been a wonderful evening together.
Sure. And we just want to emphasize to the folks out there that this has been recorded, and that if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask offline, please feel free to do that. And you can reach out to either Mr. Reynolds or Ms. Lindsay, and they'll be happy to help you with that.
Great. Thank you so much. We're so grateful, Dr. Linke.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.